I'm here with Professor Helen Cahill, the Director of the Youth Research Center and the Deputy Dean of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Thank you very much, Helen, for your time for this interview. So if I may start with the first question and ask you, what makes gender and sexuality important areas for discussion and research in education?
Gender and sexuality are both important factors to consider when taking a social justice perspective approach to understanding classrooms and schools. And I use those terms separately on purpose. So we are accustomed to thinking about gender in terms of issues like gender equity in relation to access to school, participation in class, and outcomes from learning, progression into careers. So gender equity is an important theme, and we explore understandings of gender a lot through looking at research around learning attainment outcomes. But equally important is social health research, which shows up what is the lived experience for students of any particular gender as they travel through their school life. So the social relations that are developed out of social norms around gender and how they influence young people's well-being and participation at school. And gender is, of course, an issue we look at not only with a male-female binary perspective, but we also include thinking about gender diversity, so diverse gender identities, accounting for the ways in which our students identify their own membership categories, whether they're static, traditional male or female binary, whether they're fluid, neither belonging to one or other category, or whether students identify as transgender. Additionally to that, we also do need to think about sexualities in relation to justice in schools. And the reason for that is not so much because students are sexually active in their social relations at school. No, it's about, again, a question of identity. So where we teach and understand a world purely in a heteronormative model, so we only understand heterosexual relations as the dominant form of sexuality, we practice a form of erasure. That is making invisible for children that there are other alternative persons and identities and preferences. And indeed, many of the important characters in history have been successful in their fields and have not belonged to the heteronormative model. So the fact that children never learn, for example, that a famous artist or a famous mathematician was same-sex attracted, or they never understand the possibility of the identity and existence of a transgender person, the net effect of that is problematic, not only for the persons themselves who are members of those categories, who don't feel recognised, but also for everybody else. Everybody else also misses out if they don't understand that the human condition is diverse and that is part of our world, our social world. So they miss out on the opportunity to form positive and respectful and engaged relationships with persons of diverse gender identities and diverse sexualities. So all around, everyone misses out if we don't take an inclusive approach to understanding both gender and sexualities in our mindset as we approach schooling.
My second question is, how do you approach the topics of gender and sexuality through your own research and work in education?
There are a number of ways that people address issues of gender and sexualities in schools. And some of these are through policy imperatives, legal imperatives around protecting the rights of young people in schools and indeed teachers in schools. My own work has been chiefly focused at the pedagogical level. What do we teach in schools to enable young people to recognise, affirm and understand how to have positive gender relations and also have fulfil sort of positive and safe sexual lives as they evolve in their futures. So the pedagogical approach, like any other, dedicates classroom time to effective learning and teaching activities to help to teach the things that children need to know and to bring to them the opportunities for socially critical thought that they need to inform their behaviours and their health-related choices. So my own work has been involved heavily in developing tools and resources and teaching manuals for giving support and structure to teachers to help guide them into effective approaches to teaching about both gender and sexuality in classrooms. One project where I'm working on that currently is for the Victorian Department of Education, and I've written with my colleagues and my support of my team at the Youth Research Centre a set of teaching and learning resources that go from foundation through to year 11 and 12, written to the Victorian curriculum, which include both a focus on developing social emotional learning and positive gender relations. It's called the Resilience, Rights and Respectful Relationships Program. It's open access, available online, and it provides a guided approach for the teacher. So what you'll see in an approach like that is what we would call not only an evidence-informed approach to the design of the learning activities, but also a theoretically informed approach. So in devising these learning activities, we draw a lot on the work that's been done in gender theory around thinking around how do we understand what is gender and how might we bring children to those kinds of understandings, and how do we equip children to do socially critical thought about the influences on their own and other people's gender norms and the outcomes of some of those pressures when they relate to people's choices and behaviours. So the development of a teaching and learning program is really important, and in parallel with that, provision of teacher professional learning activity. In a parallel with that, for UNESCO, I've also have developed a resource to assist with a major priority of the UN around prevention of gender-based violence in school settings. And we've developed a resource called Connect with Respect, which is also available open access online. And it was developed for schools in the Asia Pacific region to guide teachers on methods to use to teach for the prevention of gender-based violence, teaching both the positive social and relational skills that are needed for having great relationships with other people, regardless of who the others are, and also heightening awareness of the limiting and confining effect of gender norms, and looking to see where those confining practices lead to negative outcomes and how they could be challenged. And the interesting thing about that is that what I'm observing is that teachers around the world are really, really excited when they see a method for engaging children around these issues in a way that invites a kind of embodied and experiential but also socially critical learning, which holds away the kind of finger-pointing rhetoric that sometimes we can have in blaming scripts around problems around gender and gender practices, and allows young people to be actively involved in constructing a vision for the kinds of relationships they think would make the world a really good place, and indeed make their classrooms great places for learning.
And what role do you think teachers can play in addressing some of the inequities that might arise from, for instance, issues of gender and sexuality?
There are a lot of things that teachers can do to prevent inequities in relation to gender and sexualities in schools. On one level, there's the proactive teaching for inclusive and respectful relationships. On the other level, though, every teacher on an everyday level will always be engaged in relational practices through which, A, they model respectful relationships and inclusive approaches to diversity in their way in which they communicate with their students and model their own behaviour. But secondly, always and every day, teachers are also needing to respond to student behaviours. So from time to time, they will note practices in the classroom which you would call forms of stigmatising or negative talk or negative behaviour based on either gender or sexuality or both. So, for example, when a teacher lets that go by, they send a covert signal to the class that that behaviour is acceptable. But when the teacher picks up behaviours like sexist name calling or labelling of students in a pejorative way with a gender or sexuality associated term, for example, using a term like gay as a put-down term, using a term like don't be like a girl as a put-down term to govern masculinities, letting those go past in a classroom has a harmful impact. So there's a lot of research that shows that if teachers pick up these practices, interrupt them, challenge them and stop them, that you will get reductions in forms of bullying and victimisation around sexualities and gender in the school. So the teacher not only modelling good practices, but also catching up and dealing with inappropriate behaviours, setting a very important moral standard and relational standard. And of course, the third thing they're doing, even when they're not teaching explicitly for and about gender and gender relations, is they're always looking at what's included in their curriculum. What are the resources and stimulus materials? Do they have a overly male-centric focus? Have they looked for more diverse examples? You'll see this consciousness being well and truly raised by bodies of research, for example, where investigators have gone in and really closely looked at all of the most commonly and popularly used fictions that children read. So one study looked at 100 popular books read by children and looked to see where were boys, where were girls, where were men and where were women in those texts. And what they discovered is that central characters are chiefly male, female characters rarely have a lot to say, and if they have anything to say, it's coming from a supportive role or a non-separate identity. So being critical around the stimulus materials we bring to the classroom, attempting to even up the imbalance, actively looking to make visible and respected diverse sexualities and genders in the source materials helps to normalise the presence of our population. So the teacher's job in curating and presenting knowledge, regardless of subject area, is also really, really important.
If you could give an advice to a teacher who's entering the profession and who deals with students from diverse gender and sexualities, what would that advice be?
When you're entering as a new teacher, or even as an experienced teacher entering a new class or a new school, it's always a time for reflecting on the fact that I don't know my students. And I should not make presumptions about who they are. I should see part of my professional role as getting to know them. And equally, in getting to know a student and getting to know my class, I bring respectful practices to them. There are certain parts of a student's biography that they don't want to share in a classroom or a school. It's a public place, and that should be respected. But regardless of how much of their biography or their personhood that I know, I can always be a stance for, no matter who you are and where you come from and who you identify to be, you will feel respected by me, your teacher. So even if you're not sure how best to deal with children of any who manifest as different from others in some way, you will always know your background position is how do I show respect. Now there's a little bit of work around that, because showing respect, it also, what you do has to also be recognised as respect on the student's part. So taking a respectful orientation towards your students also means you have to be really attentive to see if they are picking you up as respectful, and is other work needed there in the communicative act. When dealing with issues around diversity in the classroom, particular gender or sexual diversity, you should also enter, for example, an Australian school knowing that we have laws and policies in place to protect the rights of both students and teachers. And that can give you comfort to know that the position that you're working from is supported by your organisation. Nonetheless, as we know, there are gaps in many places in the world between policy and practice. So I would advise you to be very attentive and do some research in your school to find out how is policy enacted in your school. Are there gaps that you or the students might fall into that need to be mindfully anticipated in order to avert any harm to you or the students? And so part of a respectful practice in entering a new environment is to do your research with the staff and the school leadership as well, to find out what goes on around here. How do we look out for all of our children? What do we do when and if we feel that a child is being victimised or excluded or experiencing a form of invisibilisation or erasure? What do we do in this school about that? And then bringing to the table your own understanding and philosophies about what might make a contribution. So we do know that a teamed approach is strongest, a whole school approach is strongest in any area where we're thinking about children's wellbeing. So I would say be mindful of respect to the individual and learn about your class and learn about your school.
Helen, it has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.